Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 104 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Government Operations and Estimates. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, October 17, 2022, the committee is meeting to consider matters related to the ArriveCAN application. Reminder, please do not put earpieces next to the microphones as it causes feedback and potential injury to our very valued translators. Welcome back to OGGO, Ms. Maynard. I understand you have an opening statement, please.
I do, thank you. Merci. Alors, je vous remercie de m'avoir invité.
Thank you very much for having invited me today. It's been 3 years since my last appearance before the committee, but I think that the majority of what I'm going to be saying today really will be a repetition of what was said before during my previous appearances.
Start of the pandemic, my message has been the same. In April of 2020, as government institutions came to grips with the impacts of remote work, I issued a very clear warning. The extraordinary circumstances we found ourselves in has not suspended the right of access to information, a quasi-constitutional right, nor did they absolve institutions of the duty to document, which is a principle that underpins this right and is at the heart of government transparency. After all, as I noted in my January 2021 submission to the government's review on access to information, the right of access is contingent on 2 factors. 1, institutions properly documenting their key actions and decisions, and 2, the retention of these records. Simply put, the right to access government records depends on those records actually existing. In those early days of the pandemic, I spelled out the requirements of this duty in practical terms. Heads of institutions needed to ensure that their officials generated, captured, and kept track of records documenting decisions and actions. These records are also needed to be properly managed at all times. I asked leaders to set the example by providing clear direction and updating guidance on how information was to be managed in their new operating environment. Comme j'anticipais des conséquences
Because I foresaw the grave consequences that could arise from a failure to do so, I also offered a prediction for the future. In a statement published April 2020, I said, when the time comes for a full accounting of the measures taken and the vast financial resources committed by the government during this emergency, Canadians will expect a comprehensive picture of the data, the deliberations, and the policy decisions that determined the government's overall response to COVID-19. In the months that followed, I continued to insist on the importance of carefully documenting decisions and actions and to efficiently manage information. In fact, I then explained how challenges faced by public servants in management information, capturing it, and storing it in government repositories were creating barriers to transparency and eroding government's accountability to all Canadians. You will find similar references in the speech that I gave before your committee when I appeared previous to this day.
You can understand that I was dismayed by the release of the Auditor General's report detailing that the Canada Border Services Agency's documentation, financial records, and controls were so poor that she was unable to determine the precise costs of the ArriveCAN application. I reject any suggestion that in retrospect, a failure of this nature was justifiable or even understandable given the circumstances that arose from the pandemic. I also take issue with the notion that this type of outcome could not have been foreseen. Comme je l'ai démontré, je savais pertinemment qu'une situation
As I have demonstrated, I was acutely aware of the possibility of this type of scenario, that it could happen, and that it has been consistently and repeatedly after issuing warnings to that effect. So, in conclusion, I would like to remind you that my mandate is very specific. I investigate complaints about the processing of access requests by the government institutions. I can confirm that the office of my office has received complaints about requests related to various contracts awarded by institutions during the pandemic. As my investigations must be carried out in a confidential manner, I will not be able to comment further on them. Nonetheless, I will be very pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maynard. Appreciate again that you were able to join us today. We'll start with 6 minutes with Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Menard, for joining us today. I appreciated your opening comments, and I think no truer words back in 2020 were spoken in regards to the collection of information, the duty to document, and the retention of information. And I think what we're seeing today, as you pointed out, in the report of the Procurement Ombudsman as well as the Auditor General, that there are gaps in either documentation being created or kept. We don't know whether documentation was never created or whether it was destroyed. And these are some questions that we need to get to the bottom of as a committee that is responsible to ensure that Canadians are getting good value for the money that is being spent on their behalf. I know that your office investigates complaints from individuals who believe they have been denied their rights under the Access to Information Act, and that you strive to ensure compliance with it. And one of my concerns would be the inability for members of Parliament, through the work that they're doing on committees, to be able to access information. We've had to abandon a study that we were doing on outsourcing with a specific focus on McKinsey, because we were not able to access documents, and not able to access meant that there were departments that simply refused to provide this committee with the information necessary to complete that study and come forward with any recommendations. I also note that that part of your role is to function in an advisory role to Parliament and parliamentary committees. And so what advice do you have for parliamentarians, or how can your office help parliamentarians in their ability to access information from departments in the trying to undertake our duties as parliamentarians?
It's difficult for me to provide advice to you as parliamentary in accessing information outside of the system of the access to information, because my role is really to implement the Act. And I know that some of you have used the Act, and you know how frustrating that could be as well, because of delays, because of exemptions being used. My office is not able to see cabinet confidence within our investigations as well. It's something that we are the only jurisdiction in Canada that a commissioner does not have access to cabinet confidence to confirm that the information is actually secret of cabinets. I think that if there's an advice is, I've been asking for a legislative review. The government had promised one within our legislation right now. There's a mandatory legislative review that was going to be happening in 2020. It led to recommendations, actually not recommendation, a list of issues with the system. But the review of the actual legislation will happen only in 2025, I'm told. So as parliamentary, I think members, you have the power to make recommendations with respect to what kind of statute you think that the Canadians are entitled to. The right of access is not just for you, but for journalists, for Canadians, for members, that there's a lot of information out there. And I always said the records of government, it's public records, they are not, it's not a privilege to access those, it's a right of access. And we should not have to struggle to get access to that information. It should be provided as voluntarily as possible. And maybe one of the things that, I advise is let's change the legislations to modernize it, to make it more accessible.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on I think, source of frustration for not only parliamentarians, but others who do submit access to information requests and the length of time that it might take for a department or a minister's office to respond. And then oftentimes the answers that are given are not as in-depth as they should be. And I know we've talked at committee about I think putting forward access to information requests in order to get the information that we're not able to get through the request for documents. I also want to note that it does say that the commissioner can issue orders related to a record, including requiring institutions to disclose information. How does that fit within the access to information process? Is that something outside of a request for information, or how do you undertake to issue orders related to a record, including requiring institutions to provide information?
This is an authority that...
I apologize. That is our time. You might have to get back to it at another intervention. Ms. Atwin, you're up for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Ms. Maynard, for joining us today. It's good to see my committee members as well. Most of us are joining from across the country. I'm here from unceded Wolastoqiyik territory in New Brunswick. And I appreciate very much your opening comments as well. The idea that, of course, a pandemic is not an excuse to not to do our due diligence, to not to cut corners. On the contrary, and I really appreciate again that you've reinforced time and time again the need to carefully document any decisions, particularly during a time of crisis. And so that's led us here. We've had a very in-depth discussion about what has transpired. Certainly a lot since the last 3 years, so that you might have come before a parliamentary committee. And I was also disappointed with what the Auditor General found. And of course, she put forward 8 recommendations, and they've been accepted. I look forward to them being implemented, of course. And also the Office of Procurement Ombuds. They put forward a procurement practice review that also had 13 recommendations. So I'd just like to ask you, in a reflection of that review, the Office of the Procurement Ombuds Procurement Practice Review, it's a mouthful, they found that the proactive publication information was missing for 17 of 41 contracts, so that's 41%. In these 17 cases, the original contract or one or more contract amendments valued at more than $10,000 were not available on the Open Government website. So what are the consequences for Canadians when contract information is not proactively disclosed?
Currently, the proactive disclosure is part of Part 2 of the legislation under the Access to Information Act, and it's Part 2 is a section that is not under my authority. So we don't have, in simple terms, I don't have the authority to investigate. I don't have an authority to accept a complaint with respect to what is proactive disclosed or not disclosed on with respect to the list that we find in Part 2. So there are no consequences, and there's no also right to complaint with respect to that part.
So do federal organizations or public servants face any consequences for not fulfilling their proactive disclosure obligations?
Not that I'm aware, unless you complain to the minister himself and they have something internally with respect to performance. There is no way to